Since 2011, he has served in Dubai as the Control Risk Associate Director and in Rabat as the International Crisis Group's North Africa Director. Prior to that, he served as Senior Advisor for Global Engagement in the State Department's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, that's a mouthful, for which he designed and implemented Muslim world outreach programs for successive Republican and Democratic administrations. He co-created the Global Innovation Through Science and Technology Program, the U.S. Science Envoy Program, and the Maghreb Digital Library. He co-chaired the U.S.-Egypt Science and Technology Department Fund and helped negotiate and implement the first major U.S.-Libya agreement in decades. He has served in short and long-term assignments for the State Department in 30 diplomatic missions in 24 Muslim-majority countries, from Mauritania to Malaysia. And I'm going to read these cities off just because I think it's fun to do so, including service in Rabat, Casablanca, Marrakesh, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Benghazi, Alexandria, and Cairo. He's also taught for 13 years at Johns Hopkins University, George Washington, Tufts, and 2 Moroccan universities. He has lectured at over 100 universities worldwide. He appears frequently on BBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, and France 24. He has co-authored After the Uprisings, Political Transition in Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, and has published analysis in foreign policy and with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Middle East Institute, and Oxford University. And in his spare time, he has co-produced 6 films and 14 excuse me, I've been corrected. It's 7, you need to update your bio. 7 films and 14 albums of Arab music. Please welcome Dr. William Lawrence. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd love to talk about all of that, but that's not our topic for tonight. But if you heard anything in the introduction that piques your interest, I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A. And while I was listening to the introduction about 6 kinds of tourists, it reminded me of 2 things. The famous quote by Ibn Battuta, the world's greatest traveler. He went about twice as far as Marco Polo, 14th century traveler. And he used to say, traveling, it leaves you speechless and turns you into a storyteller. The other thing I was thinking about is I've done a lot of government training. The sort of running joke among government trainers is there's 3 types of students in government training classes, whether at FSI or NDU or wherever. Sponges, tourists, and prisoners. Sponges are in the front row and they're just soaking it up and they're just glad to be there and they're reliving their college days and their early romances or whatever. And tourists just wanted to get out of work and thank their boss. And prisoners are there because they have to be there for training, but they really need to be back at work or they're going to lose their portfolio and not get the onward assignment. And you have to learn how to teach to those different communities. I know also as a professor, there are lots of learning styles in rooms, and the better you get at teaching. We were talking about teaching in prisons now. The better you get at teaching, the more you learn about all the different kinds of learners and keeping them all interested and getting them engaged. How do you teach to a class of people where a bunch of them did all the reading and some of them did not? Some professors take the punitive approach. No, the first 20 minutes of all my classes, I try to have a topic for today, relevant discussion with the people that didn't do the reading. And I'll link it to the news and all whatever, and everybody gets talking, and then by the time you get to the reading, it's already going, So it's just the different ways of teaching. I have a bunch of slides don't take notes. You weren't going to win. Don't take notes, and I will share the whole slide deck with the people that invited me, and I encourage them to share it with you, and you can look at it. And a lot of it's just photographs. Some people are visual learners, and so you will learn some things as we flip through the slides. Next. That's just more about me. And you heard most of it, but the bolded ones are where I was working on the whole Muslim world. So 5 years doing the Muslim World Outreach, which became global engagement under the George Bush, Karen Hughes, and then the Obama administration, the 2 Cairo speeches, all of that, and some of those programs you heard that came out of it. CSID is the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. They're having their big annual conference next week. And I taught a class with the same title as this in a number of universities, including in Morocco, and it's also been offered at Georgetown University. Next slide. This is where I work now, the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. We call that the pear or the bicycle seat, but it's Arabic calligraphy for our logo. Next slide. We're going to flip these really quickly. So we've done over 300. I just added 6. We've done 364 visits to the MENA region. Next, taken now over 900 professors from all over the U.S. to the MENA region. Next, we have our Model Arab League program. Yes, including him. Model Arab Leagues and the Youth Development Leadership Development Program. We're just selecting the students for this summer now. Next. We do 16 Model Arab Leagues with about 250 universities and 2,000 students around the country every year. Next. And more about the summer. So we place people in other organizations, and then we add site visits to places like State Department and DoD, and I give 2 nightly lectures that they have to write reflections on with top speakers. Next. And this is like some of the types of organizations we place them at. Next. And we have a big policymakers conference with a lot of Gulf Royals and senior State Department people. Next. So my trajectory, I was sort of part of that post 9/11 crowd that came in as an Arabic speaker. I learned Arabic in Peace Corps and studied some other dialects and had a whole life with music and movies and stuff. And then 9/11 happened, and I was one of the people recruited in the State Department. I think I was admitted to the Foreign Service and hadn't done anything for like 6 months. And I took the Arabic test on a Friday afternoon, and I got a phone call at 8 o'clock Monday morning saying, we're inviting you to the next class. So that's what they were doing at the time with the Arabic speakers in the department. Next. And after my first short assignments, which were complicated, I won't get into, I had a family health issue. I was assigned to DC. I was then put in charge with a group of other people of Muslim World Outreach after 9/11 as an Arabic speaker with a PhD in International Affairs and Islamic Civilization, and I studied a lot of Islamic law and other Islamic stuff. And we sort of asked, okay, so Muslim World Outreach to who? Like, to what's the Muslim world? And nobody really knew. No one had ever really asked the question in the department. There's the OIC, which doesn't have all the Muslim countries in it, that has non-Muslim majority members. So one of the early things we did was map the Muslim world for the government. Next. And this is just how everything was bad. You know, the early post 9/11 stuff was all about how Muslims are happy in the United States. That's Elias Zerhouni, who became our first science envoy on the right. And I went to 8 countries with him in the Science Envoy program, but he was head of NIH, creator of PEPFAR, a successful Muslim American, and we did this Madison Avenue approach about how Muslims are happy in the United States, and the feedback the State Department was getting at the time was, we know Muslims back then we're happy in the United States. It's your foreign policy we have problems with, not, you know, how Muslims are treated. That has changed since then, but back then. Next slide. So it was a marketing failure. Next slide. So that mapping thing, we basically mapped the Muslim world, and no one had really done it before, and we learned many things on the mapping exercise, but I'll just pick out a couple for you. One is almost half of the world's Muslims live in 4 countries in South Asia. No one had ever really thought about that, and it sort of changed our approach in certain respects. Next slide. So those 4 countries are there, and in the top 9 countries, population-wise, you only have 1 Arab country. So we're talking about other places than the Arab world. Next, and more information there. Next, But when you talk about countries that are over 90% Muslim, then you're talking about a band of countries from Central Asia down to West Africa. And what we found out, and you can find these on Wikipedia, what's it called? WikiLeaks, although I'm not supposed to look at it. It's still to look at cables I wrote on WikiLeaks. Yeah, exactly. Everybody does, right? But if you go on WikiLeaks, you can see all the cables where we're asking the embassies how to do this, and we're getting really interesting responses. And this map sort of maps it well. So there was a central group of countries that wanted more engagement from the United States on the basis of being Muslim countries. And we call it interfaith, they call it dialogue of civilizations, but they wanted Islam to be part of the conversation. And then there was an arc of countries over the top, and an arc of countries through sort of Central and Sahelian Africa through the bottom over to India, which has a huge Muslim population, that wanted us to engage with them and not mention religion at all. I remember this cable we got from Bosnia saying, please don't bring up religion. I remember when we rolled out the program, an Indian journalist got up and says, what does science have to do with religion? You know, and as we were rolling out all these science programs from the Cairo speech. But on the other hand, all of these 90% countries wanted us to recognize their pain, you know, all the Islamophobia, all the stuff they were dealing with. And so we had to kind of bifurcate our strategy in all kinds of interesting ways, but one had to do with that central line and then the two arcs. Next, you know, everyone's like, why do they hate us? You know, it turned out when the State Department did a lot of polling, a lot of it through like the secret polling that INR does, when we looked at it, Americans were very admired for science and technology, for education, and what did I say, education, and not a lot of other things. You know, other things less. And so a lot, as you may have read in the news early on, in the outreach in those early years after 9/11, we did a lot of entrepreneurship programs, a lot of science to market programs, a lot of technology-oriented things. It was interesting when Ivanka Trump came in, she took over a lot of these women in entrepreneurship programs we had started at the time as we were sort of delving into that space of sort of what countries wanted to engage with us more as they were kind of mad at us about other stuff. Next slide. So, and then in the Science Envoy program, when we started going out to countries all over the world, started with Muslim majority countries, the blue stuff we kind of knew they wanted to deal with us on. The green stuff came out from the visit. And one of the things that the U.S. is not very good at and has never been good at, which is shown well here, is that the U.S. is really good at, until AID was shut down, at assisting with women and child health care and sort of 0 to 20 issues involving youth. And then when the youth bulge, not caused by high childbirth rates, because those were going down everywhere in the world. It's that the mortality rates were dropping twice as fast as the fertility rates, which means all of these young countries had 2 or 3 times as many young people reaching adulthood, needing employment, and we were doing nothing for that. And I remember the first time I realized this, I was at a meeting with UNICEF at my university, and I put up my hand, I'm like, well, all these vaccination campaigns and all this women and child, I'm all for it, but what about the extra millions of kids that are surviving now because of these programs? And UNICEF director said, we've noticed that, but we don't really have an idea. You know, and then what happened in these youth bulk countries, which a lot of them are Muslim majority, right, is that you know, kids need international assistance until they're 18, and then we don't care anymore. And they become what? Migrants, terrorists, drug addicts, you know, jobless people in countries all over Africa, the Muslim world, and we never had really thought about the implications of our largesse. And so there was a lot of thinking about how to deal with young adults as we started to look at all of this. Next thing, I just did a quick note on religiosity. So we have a lot of different religiosity in the United States. That's also true for the world, and it's also true for the Muslim world. Next slide. So if it's straight up religiosity, and I won't go through how this stuff's measured, I mean, the Muslim world's a little more religious than us. Countries like Iran are the same as us. Iran is actually not very religious. Turkey is. And there's been a lot of interesting articles in the Middle East studies about why the Turks are so religious and the Iranians aren't. But anyway, but then when you get in those countries, next slide, they're really religious is a quite small group. And most Muslims in most countries, and this is a survey of 11 Arab countries, aren't that religious. And it's something we don't really understand when we think about the Muslim world. We think about how fanatic they are, and this, that, and the other thing, that actually there's a lot of agnosticism and atheism now in the Arab and Muslim world. There's a lot of, so let's say, soft, like a Friday Catholic, Friday Muslim, or Sunday Catholic, Friday Muslim, and a lot of people who are more like Muslim identity than they are Muslim practicing. I remember the first time I took Grover Norquist around Morocco, and the call to prayer went out, and he was like, "Why isn't anybody going to the mosque?" And I'm like, "Those Moroccans don't go to the mosque." It's great. It's Palestinian. So next slide. So a little bit about Islam quickly. Next slide. What we did is, I don't know if it's on the slide, but we came up with this concept of MMMP countries, so Muslim majority, Muslim plurality countries in those maps. And there were 43 Muslim majority countries and 7 Muslim plurality countries. And just while we're at it, Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, by far. It's the fastest growing religion in the United States, by far, even with everything that's going on. And it's something we need to get smart about. It's also, we have quite a few more Muslims than Jews in the United States, but Pew and organizations, a lot of them out of New York, try to mask that and tell you there are more Jews in the United States than Muslims, but it's about at least 30% more Muslims now, but it's with the way they count it too. Anyway, next, there's no Shia crescent, it's blobs. Next slide. This is just a random slide to fit better here than anyone else. So the oldest university in the world is Morocco. It was in Morocco. UNESCO recognizes it. It was founded by a woman. Learn about it. Visit it when you go to Morocco. And our universities in the West are built on the North African model, coming out of Cairo and Tunis and Morocco and other places. Europeans will tell you the oldest university in the world is in Bologna. So where did that come from? Well, it was based on Arab universities, but they wiped it out of their history. And it was, seminar-style classrooms like Arabs, the grading system, the subjects, it was all Arab, but they didn't, the Renaissance was all about rediscovering Greek and Roman culture in Europe without mentioning that the Arabs and Muslims had preserved it and developed it for 7 centuries, and then they wiped that out of their history. So. And Europe is only now rediscovering how much they owe to Arab and Muslim cultures for all of that preserved knowledge that came from Baghdad to Cordoba and found its way various ways up to Spain after the Reconquista and the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from Spain. Next slide. When I started in diplomacy, religion was almost a dirty word, and I could tell you a bunch of stories now. I don't have time for it. Ask during the Q&A if you're interested. But during my period at State and afterwards, religion has become more and more and more and more part of the conversation because we realized, again, countries want that to be part of it. We helped save the Amman conference in 2005. It was a U.S. diplomatic behind-the-scenes intervention, and I was involved. And Ambassador Welch said, the Assistant Secretary said, we don't do religion, and we worked a behind-the-scenes solution with his blessing and helped solve the Amman, look up the Amman conference 2005. So, there's a lot you can do when you get smart about religion and think about it in a constructive way. Next slide. Oh, and she wrote that, so I met her. Go back. So I briefed the Secretary of Commerce once with Madeleine Albright, and I went up to her and I said, I read your book, I loved it, it's amazing, somebody needed to write this book, The Mighty and the Almighty, and she's like, I'm so glad you're like the only person that read it. Next slide. So there's this whole long history of the U.S. and the Muslim world, but I'm going to give you some little flashes and tidbits here. I can talk about it more during the Q&A. But the U.S. Navy, the U.S. First treaties, the U.S. International engagements were very much driven by U.S. relations with Barbary states right from the beginning. Morocco was not the first country to recognize the United States. France recognized the U.S. in December 17, 1777. Morocco recognized it December 20th, 1777, although the Moroccan letter took several more months to get there. Moroccan officials have castigated me on television for being wrong. I know the guy that developed the postage stamp in Morocco, but I got the website changed at the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Morocco, which says that Morocco is the longest. My wife doesn't even like That's my the U.S. Morocco has the longest unbroken treaty relationship with the U.S., but it wasn't the first to recognize. What nobody tells you is the reason the French treaty was broken was because we had 2 wars with France in our early, including the Quasi-War, and Morocco declared war on us in 1801 and fought with Libya against us till 1804, which they conveniently ignore when they're talking about unbreaking treaty, but actually they didn't break the treaty, so technically they're right. So anyway, Morocco was second. Next slide. And there's this really cool letter you can Google when George Washington writes the Sultan of Morocco. The reason why the U.S. engaged with the States was there was a lot of North African piracy, and they fed the spoils of piracy into whoever was ruling the coast. The pirates would, and the U.S. immediately, upon gaining not just independence, just starting to fight with England, needed protection for its shipping against the pirates, so they started paying basically tribute to the sultans to protect the U.S. ships, and that's what prompted the letter. So it was basically, what do you call it? Not blood money, but it was an arrangement with Barbary leaders to get us recognized and get our ships protected. But George Washington writes this beautiful letter to the Sultan of Morocco where he basically says, we're a small, weak, agrarian country. Someday we hope we're like you. I mean, it's really interesting to hear, in his voice, the way he's describing the United States. Next slide. And then the coolest thing for people like me, particularly who work in the religious space, is the Treaty of Tripoli, signed in 1796, ratified in 1797, unanimously by the U.S. Senate, signed by President Adams, which said, because, can you read that? The government of the United States of America is not in any way founded on the Christian religion. We can have this type of relationship with Mohammedan nations. And just recently, I wanted to go a little deeper, so I looked at the renewal of the treaty, I think in 1804 or 1805, and they had very similar language. So our deist founders said we weren't a Christian country. And then go back and look at your Jefferson and the human rights stuff he did in Virginia, and the tower at the University of Virginia with the rights and his Koran, and you sort of rethinking. It wasn't that they were against religion, it's that they didn't want religion in politics to mix. And they didn't want us to be a Christian country. We didn't become a Judeo-Christian country until after World War II, when that term was reinvented, unvarnished, and it was guilt over the Holocaust that led to this concept of Judeo-Christian, which is now, some people try to replace with the concept of Abrahamic, but there is no Christian foundation of the United States if you actually look at the documents. Next slide. The whole telling of Muslim Americans is not really well told, but I just like to let you know there's a new series on PBS for the American 250th coming out, produced by my new friend Asma Khalid, who is the longtime NPR morning reporter, and it's a 6-part series on PBS coming in May, I think. And she has 6 episodes, and the first one was on the most famous Muslim in Georgetown in the 1820s. So he was a freed slave from West Africa and became the best brick maker in Georgetown and charged 50% more than the other brick makers, and built a mansion for himself up near Dent Place in Georgetown. And there's a plaque that went up during COVID that nobody noticed in Georgetown. Anyway, he's the whole first episode of Esma Khalid's series. I don't know what the other 5 are. But we're only beginning to learn about our own history of Muslims. Now, Muslims in the U.S. right now is about 2%, but I was looking into the slavery data recently, and we were probably 5% Muslim in 1790s, if you count the slaves, because about 30% of the slaves were Muslim. So that whole history of Islam in the United States is just not known. These are all PhD dissertations to be written. Next slide. The philanthropist who pays for my salary and who John Kaiser, who works on North Africa a lot and on interfaith. He also wrote 2 books on Algeria. This book is on Commander of the Faithful, about the Algerian head of state who was probably one of the best-known Muslims in the 19th century. When he died, the New York Times called him the ablest Muslim sovereign. There's a town named after him in Iowa, El-Kate or Ira, where there's a competition every year to emulate him. When you go to Geneva and walk in the Red Cross, there's 2 busts There's the founder of the Red Cross and his bust because of the way he treated French prisoners during the Algerian struggle. And he saved over 10,000 Christians from a pogrom in Damascus in 1860, and Abraham Lincoln sent him 2 pistols as a thank you that are in the Algerian Museum in the museum in Algiers. You know, one of these moments we forgot, you know. Next slide. But the coolest thing I found out lately is there were tens of thousands of U.S. Civil War soldiers that dressed up as North Africans in the battles. Why? There was a French, doctor who learned gun drills and came to the U.S. in the 1840s. And he started putting together, remember when I was at summer camp, I was young, we used to do the, the flipping of the guns, and like they do it this way. Right, so we used to do that at camp. Well, that started in the 1840s with this French ex-military guy who taught Americans how to do it. And they used to travel all around the United States doing these drills, these gun drills that had been learned from this French guy. And they were called the Zouaves. The Zouaves was named after Zouawa, which was an Algerian tribe and dissidents that fought with Abou Khadr, the guy in the last screen, who were defeating the French until the French defeated them, and then they became part of the French pacification effort in their colonial period. But they had the best sort of battlefield tactics, right? So these Americans learned how to handle weapons and then fight like them. And then, at the beginning of the Civil War, they were some of the best people to fight on the two sides. So there were over 1,000 New York fire Zouaves. There were over 10,000 northern troops that dressed up like North Africans. They drank less, went to prostitutes less, had a lot of discipline. They picked that up from the Muslims. And there were thousands of southern Zouaves too on both sides at the Civil War. Next, show the Louisiana Zouaves. Those guys. And next slide. So Google that. Tens of thousands of Americans dressing up like North Africans in our Civil War. Who knew? And Ron Maxwell, who bought the rights to that film 4 slides ago and wants to make a series based on John Kaiser's book, had Zouaves in his movie. And I've gotten to know Ron Maxwell later. He made Gettysburg and Copperhead and Gods and Generals. And he didn't really know what they were doing. They're in his movie, but he didn't know why there were these guys in baggy pants, North African-looking clothes in his movie. They were in there because the reenactors knew, but they weren't. And that's one of the reasons this film is so appreciated, because somebody says it's the best war film ever made. But he didn't realize how good the reenactors were until I told him about some of this stuff. Next slide. So our next big engagement with the Muslim world was Operation Torch. I could spend another 2 hours on that. But basically, the strategy of World War II was to be able to invade Europe later by defeating the Nazis in North Africa. And there were big debates between the Americans and Churchill about where to invade and how to invade, and whether to go straight for Tunis or via Morocco and all that. But the Americans landed in Morocco November 12, 1942, I think. Next slide. As they also hit other points in North Africa. Yeah. Next slide. And the Moroccans and the French of Morocco gave up very, very quickly. The Casablanca Conference was shortly thereafter at Villa Mirador, where we were last year at the council. Next slide. And so that's us visiting Villa Mirador and commemorating the Casablanca Conference. And we had Delano Roosevelt, the grandson of FDR, our former president there, and Ron Maxwell, second from the right, that filmmaker, and he was scoping. Boucher went to meet with some Moroccan directors and actors who might be in the film. And anyway, this is a bunch of people. For John Pratt, our chairman of our board of national councils on the left. And this is a private residence, so they gave us a private tour of the grounds. Next slide. And then when we were in Tunisia just before, Ron Maxwell's father was a veteran who was in Operation Torch, and that's Del Roosevelt at the North Africa Cemetery in Tunisia. 4,000 Americans lie there. Not all identified. There's amazing DNA work going on now to identify the few hundred that never got identified. It's very moving if you ever get to Tunisia. Definitely go to the North African Cemetery there. Next slide. That's a family visiting a previous time I'd gone. Next slide. And that's Del receiving the flag that was flying the day Jimmy Carter died at the cemetery, and we folded up and gave it to him as a thank you for the Roosevelt service to the nation. Next slide. What also is not known is that the Moroccans played a large role in the victories in World War II. The toughest battle in the Western theater of World War II was not D-Day. it was Monte Cassino. And Monte Cassino, which was the road to Rome in Italy, had 9 rounds of battles over a 4-month period. And the Americans were basically defeated, like sitting in the mud down on the coast. And it was the Moroccan troops from the Reef that broke through the lines with U.S. air support and opened up the road to Rome, which led to the southern successes, which led to D-Day being able to be more successful. Moroccans were wiped out of history. They were called French troops. I had a friend who dedicated his life, a historian, to getting the Moroccans French war benefits, pensions.
Right.
He was Israeli-American. A historian, get them their due because they were sort of despised by Moroccans as being sort of tools of the French and despised by the French as Arabs, you know, and they were sort of lost in the middle, and that was just his campaign as a historian. Next slide. I'm just going to skip forward to, you know, how they're talking and thinking about us now. So these successive Muslim bans in the United States are going over extremely badly in the Muslim world, whether it's the Trump 1.0 bans or the 2.0 non-immigration visa bans, 75 countries, most of them Muslim majority. Next slide. That was the original 7. One of them wasn't even Muslim. Next slide. Same map. Next slide. But this was mostly Peace Corps volunteers' fault. Peace Corps volunteers today. So you may remember that when the first Muslim ban came out, it was Peace Corps volunteers all around the country and others at airports trying to help people get through the bad situation they were in, coming into the United States and being sort of accused of things from go. Next slide. I teach whole classes on Islamism. I teach another whole class on radical Islam. But the main thing from this slide is, if I can look at my own. First of all, when we talk about scholarship about Islam and scholarship about Islamism, there are kind of 2 camps. There's what we call the accommodationists and the confrontationists. And the confrontationists basically say all Muslims are dangerous, or most of them, except maybe my friend who's Muslim, you know, and all Muslims are, because of what's in the text, or a threat, and they have double discourse. You can't believe a word they're saying. They can lie to us for religion, you know, all of that. And the same thing when it comes to Islamists, and that's what I call the confrontationist camp. And the accommodations camp basically says there's a lot of different kinds of Muslims, there's a lot of different kinds of Islamists, and we have to kind of be smart about that as we engage with the Muslim world, where 99% of Muslims aren't killing anybody, you know, and not engaging in any kind of war, even though 10% of them are probably willing to join a military cause against Americans because of what's going on in Palestine. You know, now in Salafism, that's another thing to get smart about, because most Salafists are peaceful. They're called Dawah or scientific Salafists, and they're basically not engaging in any kind of warfare. The Madkhalis in Libya and in Saudi, you know. And then there's the political Salafists, political parties like Noor Party in Egypt, and the smallest group is the Jihadi Salafis. So again, this is just whetting your appetite to sort of get smarter about, you know, Islam, about Islamism, about Salafism. It's not what you hear most of the time, because everything's so politically charged in the U.S. And if I can just throw out another point here, after terrorist attacks attributed to Muslims in the United States, violence against Muslims goes up a little. In election years, it goes up by 4 times, because there's so much Sharia law and Muslim bashing in U.S. elections that people want to take it out on Muslims in their midst. So Islam's become very politicized in the U.S. gradually since 9/11, and it's become part of our politics. And if you're not aware of that, just in Northern Virginia, people got basically voted out because they met with somebody. You know, like there's a lot of guilt by association in U.S. elections for talking to Muslims, dealing with Muslim groups. So just something to be aware of. Next slide. This is just a slide, I won't waste your time on it, but I do a lot of work in counter-violent extremism. We were talking about it in terms of your work earlier. Most of our approaches to CVE were wrong. We're finding out more about how to do it. Probably the most important thing we've learned studying terrorists, which I spent part of my career doing, and violent Muslims, which I spent part of my career doing, is the role of trauma. in their lives that lead to these situations, and how, as you're dealing with, for example, foreign fighters returning from the battlefield, like from Syria and Iraq, and they come back to their countries, if you don't deal with their trauma, there's more recidivism than if you actually deal with what led them to those causes in the first place. I think that's the simplest way I can talk about this line of work. Next slide. Next slide. Same general idea. Next slide. Just a random slide. I could show you 1,000 like this, but the U.S. is viewed extremely negatively around the world by regular Muslim and Arab populations. I mean, look, we're 2% popular here, like Russia, China, and Turkey are much more better viewed. This is the survey data. If you're not reading your newspaper, it should be in there. Next slide. U.S. is the biggest threat, or the second biggest threat after Israel, according to Muslims across Muslim lands. Next slide. This is just sort of our foreign policy priorities in the Trump administration now. And those shift up and down depending on what's in the news and what's the priority. Next slide. But just, we're at the last two slides. I did have the opportunity at Annapolis University to develop with 9 other people a new course on the history of global politics, in which it's basically the history of human civilization. And I went into it very humbly thinking, what do I know about, all of human civilization? And we spent a whole year reading into all of human history to sort of figure out how you could put all of it in one class. But at the end of the process, I learned a lot of things. And one was, world history is way simpler than I thought it was in many respects. And one of the main things is that through most of human history until the last 100 years, it was basically a story of empires. And it's the story of about 70 empires that mattered and other less important empires. And then other political anomalies like tribes, city-states, corporate states like the East India Company and other things that operate on the margins of empires but not more powerfully than empires. And that empires, like regimes, like any human organization, basically rise and fall in predictable patterns, very predictable patterns. And those patterns, more than anything else, have to do with human hubris, greed, and human frailty. Period. And so I spent a lot of time after developing that course and my lectures and my teaching and things, spending more time talking about human nature and the givens of international politics, geography, and humans, while other things are in flux like climate and technology and all of these other things. But whether you're doing counterterrorism, which I do training on, whether you're doing engagement, which I do training and work in that field, it's more than anything else about understanding the humans you're dealing with, their strengths and weaknesses, and then how to engage with them or get through to them or fight them or whatever we're talking about. But it's the human element that is underlooked all too often when we're looking at structural or geopolitical factors and reasons to explain things when an end. It's the humans and human agency that's the most important element. So I spend more time having us look back, because nothing is new when it comes to human failures. It's all happened before. Next slide. And this is one of the greatest, what some people call the greatest historian of all time. Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century North African historian. He was called he invented social history, invented monetary theory, invented a whole theory of cyclical versions of history, sort of took the best of the Greek and Roman learning on history and brought it up into the Middle Ages. And Toynbee and Gellner called him, one of the greatest historians, greatest minds in human history. And he gave what Toynbee called the greatest definition of government ever created by a human mind. He said, a government is an institution that prevents injustice other than that which it commits itself. Thank you.
No, there's a microphone. There's two. Two microphones there. Yeah.
Thank you very
It is working, but it might not be loud.
Hello?
Do you want the other one? This one's working.
That's about
Really?
Yeah, take this one.
Okay, well, you're going to get the bad one then.
We'll hand it back.
Okay, oh, I hand it back. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I'm not sure if you painted a really good picture there, but anyway. So you talked about...
Happy Talk lectures next week.
So you talked about how the U.S. is perceived by Muslims in the world today, which is not a positive thing. What would you say was the best period of U.S.-Muslim relations?
During and after World War II. I mean, there are exceptions, but that World War II moment, despite the atrocities in World War II and other issues, really built American reputation globally in lots of positive ways. Everyone's got a positive story around the world. I mean, I'm amazed how often when I'm dealing with the older people, how grateful they are about what Americans did for them all around the world. And it was as much the U.S. policies as it was the GIs just being great people, you know. So I think that helped get us through the the Cold War, in which sort of about half the world lined up with the United States, even though they didn't always agree with us. We got talking at dinner about democracy and democracy promotion. I mean, when the U.S. promotes its better values, a lot of Americans are skittish about bringing values into foreign policy. And I recommend that Kissinger, and I've assigned this reading in my classes, in his penultimate book, had a whole section on how realpolitik was kind of wrong and he should have baked values more into his thinking. And no one paid attention when Kissinger did a mea culpa. And if you don't bring values into your foreign policy, you are hurting yourself when you've got better values. And I think the U.S., when it does democracy promotion, when it does human rights promotion, yeah, it isn't always popular with the dictators and the authoritarians, but the populations pay attention. You know, and yes, Arab Spring was mostly a failure, but we were talking at dinner again. You had 18 countries in the Arab Spring. You had 30 countries involved in the Asian Spring based on the Arab Spring and the new Gen Z protests, which led to several changes of regime in Mozambique and Bangladesh and elsewhere. And you go around the world and you talk to under 30s, and under 30s, including the Muslim world, will say, we don't like your government, most of what it does, but we have friends in Minnesota and New York and California and Texas and Arkansas who are involved in No Kings, and they're our best friends, and we love them, and we love your pro-democracy crowd, and they're going to save the day. And thanks, finally, Palestinians are getting respected by Americans, and it's now the majority of Americans who are more sympathetic with Palestine than with Israel, which is just in the last year or two, you know. And so I'm not trying to make a value judgment here. I'm trying to tell you about what I'm hearing, you know, and young people in the Muslim world and beyond are enthusiastic about the possibilities for the future. And it's about democracy and human rights and things like that. So we shouldn't shy away from our positive American values that our Revolutionary War and our Civil War and our World War were all about, and our Cold War, you know. And so why step back and say, well, let you be you, and we'll be us, and democracies for a few countries in Europe, and we're all fine. And when we give you the vote, you vote for bad people anyway. But respect humans, give them dignity, give them their due. And democracy is, what is it, the worst form of government except for all the others? The Brits, you see it, Churchill said that. You know, it is. It's the worst form of government except for all the others, and we should embrace our values when we talk to the world.
All right, so World War II. After World War II, you think that was the best time? I'm not an easy person up here, by the way. So after World War II, there was this thing that happened in 1948.
Yeah.
That would be the creation or the establishment of the State of Israel. And it seems like, I don't know, I'm just thinking that, and that we ended the British protectorate of Palestine. So, I don't know, it seems like things got a little messy after the creation of Israel. And, you know, I think you made a reference to, you know, some of the, shall we say, unhappiness in the Muslim world related to the Israelis' treatment in Gaza. So, do the Jews have a right to live in Israel? And does the fact that something really terrible that's going on in Israel justify some of the reaction in the Muslim world? I told you I wasn't a fun person.
I don't mind. If I had to give that talk, I need these questions. It's all good. So first let me say that notwithstanding that the Nakba in 1948 were traumatic for Palestinians, I don't think most of the Muslim world developed the level of anger they have towards the United States on those issues until later. And there were many points along the road to point to. One thing I would point out, talking about empire, is that with the collapse of the British and the French Empire, the U.S. inherited the British colonial responsibilities, whereas French kept theirs, and it got rechristened spheres of influence. But the U.S. wasn't blamed for the British mistakes and Sykes-Picot and all that the way the Brits were blamed. So the U.S. had a little bit of a pass for a certain period because they weren't responsible for the Balfour or like any of that stuff. And then, think about 56. 56, the U.S. did not align with Britain and France against Egypt. And there were lots of moments like 56 where the U.S. took a line that was respected by Muslims, which stood out in the Muslim world, that was an anti-post-imperial line. It isn't until you get to, the 70s and 80s when the U.S. basically starts giving Israel carte blanche for everything, including settlement activity and all of that, and successive wars against the Palestinians, that the shift of anger against France and Britain, which, for example, is still alive and well in the Sahel, where we've had 12 coups in the last 6 years or so, and alive, it's that anti-French sentiment in the Sahel, which comes from that colonial period. That type of colonial sentiment didn't really become something targeted at the Americans, I would say, until the 70s, roughly, 80s. And then a series of U.S. wars, including the invasion of Iraq, which were extremely unpopular. So that's part of it. You asked about Israel's right to exist. There are about 10 ways to deconstruct that question. But let me start with two. One is, why is Israel the only country in the world that claims the right to exist? No other country claims a right to exist. And that grows out of the debates at the UN in the 40s. The second thing to point it out is that Israel will never tell you where. So that everyone has to sign off on Israel's right to exist, or they'll take away your state funding, or you'll get accused of anti-Semitism and this, that, and the other thing. But when you ask an Israeli what borders, they'll never tell you, because the agenda is a greater Israel agenda. As one of the Israeli ministers said 3 weeks after the horrendous Hamas attack on Israel, you kill us, we take your land. And this was repeated sort of ad nauseum in the early months of the Israeli war. And they took Lebanese land, and they took Syrian land, and they took over half of Gaza and still haven't. And they took a lot more of the West Bank. And they're fighting a 7-front war, which we're sort of signing off on and arming and paying our tax dollars to support, while Israelis get free health care and free education on our nickel. While we aren't addressing the fundamental issues. Nor is, I would say, because I follow this very, very closely, nor is the Board of Peace. The Board of Peace is not addressing the fundamental causes of what's going on. So we have a peace process without a process that reflects realities on the ground. I could give you 8 other responses to the right to exist thing, but just whenever you hear that question, see it for what it is. It's a litmus test to point you out as an anti-Semite or not, and it's based on very little in terms of promises from Israel on anything. There was another piece of your question at the end I'm not sure I addressed. Yes. Yeah.
So there's this book. It's called the Bible. And since you like to talk about religion, and you mentioned the role of religion and Muslim and Islam as a religion. And in this book, the Bible, it talks about a time when God appears to Abraham and he says, hey, check out this land here. From here to the sea is for you and your descendants. And that is something that the Jews have relied on, and it's also something that fundamental Christians also rely on. So when you talk about the borders, and they won't tell you what the borders are, Israel has never had those original, back in Genesis, borders. So it does go back, as they say, a few years, and there is religion involved. So it's not really a question.
So now I could go for about 2 hours. I had to do a briefing for a Jewish retreat in California a couple months ago that someone from my organization was going to speak at, and I did the whole history of Israel-Palestine from sort of both points of view. But let me lift a couple of things out of that which I think are relevant to a proper beginning of an answer. Number one, neither the Israelis nor the Philistines were native to that land. They both came around 1400 BC at the same time. Some from Egypt and some from probably the island of Crete. And they showed up almost very much at the same time and then integrated themselves into the Canaanite community and the other communities there, and both claim valid heritage to that land.
Abraham was an Iraqi.
Right. Now it wasn't Abraham. It was Abram back then.
Okay,
And then he changes the name to Abraham later.
But he was an Iraqi.
Yeah. And that the next thing I would say is that the land from the Nile to the Euphrates for his descendants was not for Jews. It was for his descendants, which include Muslims. And so if you do the genealogy of the region, and Tucker Carlson, who I don't agree on a lot of things, did this wonderfully with Huckabee. Watch the whole 2-hour interview where he gets into these things. You know, West Bank Palestinians have much a right to the land according to the Jewish arguments, as the Jews do. And Tucker Carlson pressed him on Huckabee on a lot of these issues because he's a Christian scientist and even in some ways more extreme in his thinking than the vast majority of Israelis. You know, and he was basically like, you know, who are you to say that Jews from Poland and Lithuania have more right to the land than West Bankers who never left? You know, like it's just not your Jewish land. It's for all the descendants of Abraham who are not exclusively Jewish. So the answer is there was nothing in the text itself, if you read them properly, that gives the land to modern Israel. It's just their interpretation.
I did check Genesis before I came here tonight, just to be clear. And the Lord did say to Isaac, your son Isaac, I'm going to take care of Ishmael, but Isaac is getting the land. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, so let's talk. We have this thing. We have this, and his descendants. We have this thing going on right now in this country called Iran. Iran is not an Arab country. Is that the case? Right? It's not. They're not Arab. So, what is the deal? What is Iran is surrounded by basically Arab countries, right? Most of those countries are Arab, but they don't. We've attacked them, but they don't seem to get along with their Arab Muslim neighbors. So can you just talk a little bit about Iran and the rest of the crowd? Thank you.
Yep, so I teach whole classes on Iran. Let me start by saying it has only Arabs on its part of its western flank. And it's got 2 million Arabs. So there are the literal Arabs inside Iran who are part of right now the Navy attacking the ships in the Strait. These are the Arab parts of Iran. And Iran is extremely diverse. It's far and away the most diverse Middle Eastern country with like 20 sizable ethnic groups. Farsis are just barely the majority, but there are all these other groups, Azeris and Armenians and Kurds and all these groups one of the leaders of the Iraqi Kurds was born in Free Kurdistan, which was in Iran. There was a Free Kurdistan after World War II. And then when you go to the northwest, in the north and around to the east, you're talking about Pakistanis, you're talking about Azerbaijan, Armenia, you're talking about non-Arab countries. Iran has a long, long history of empire. It was the inspiration for and the foil for the Greeks and the Romans and the Ottomans and all the Safavids and the Seljuks from there. This guy's an expert on some of that. I mean, Iran is this extremely complicated and rich history. Often it was the best empire around in history, which is why it grew so much. Other times it wasn't. And then you get to the modern Iranian history, where everybody was met at the Shah and the communists and the ethnic groups and everybody ganged up with the Khomeini types and the radical clerics and overthrew the country, never knowing that they would next be purged. Be careful who you ally with in a revolution. And then, but if you go to Iran, as I mentioned before, Iranians are very secular. They're very diverse. They're very unhappy with the regime, which is why 30,000 of them had to be shot down in January for the regime to defend itself. I'll tell you a quick story. So I was at the Middle East Studies Association annual meeting in Denver 2-3 years ago when the Iranian women protesters were all up in arms. And there was a group of eminent Middle East scholars of the United States, some of whom you've heard of. I won't mention them to embarrass them. But really famous Middle East scholars who got up in front of this crowd and basically said that Washington can't be trusted and Washington is causing all the problems in Iran, and if only the sanctions were lifted, life would be fine again, and all this stuff. And it started a shouting match, first in the room and then out in the hallway as these Iranian women got up and started really getting upset with this line that the U.S. causes all the problems in the world. They don't. That the U.S. is always just out for itself and doesn't care about local populations. Sometimes the case, not always. And that the U.S. should care more about the Iranian population, which they made an excellent case for, and most of the audience was with them, even though the scholars weren't really making sense. Let me go back to this. I've worked now 41 years in international affairs, practicing and teaching it. And when I get confused about what is the right position on international affairs, whether analytically or policy-wise, one of the first questions and last questions I always ask myself is, who are the most powerless people in this situation, and what do they need powerful people to do? And when you apply that rubric to situations, whether it's the Iranian people, whether it's Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, whether it's Lebanese right now who are getting the chute kicked out of them, whether it's any of the more refugees and migrants than ever in human history, desperately jumping into oceans and traipsing around the world right now looking for something to eat, the more, and then we took away all the assistance and dumped the food in the ocean or it was rotting, that the more we think about how to take care of the most vulnerable populations and the least powerful people, we're probably moving in the right direction in foreign policy. So that's sort of where I'm thinking about Iran or any of these other issues. That's sort of my starting and ending point.
So do you think there's ever going to be peace in the Middle East? And if so, under what circumstances?
I love that question, particularly in the context of a lecture that talked a lot about empire. Because empires stabilize things, but not always in the interest of local populations, but they can stabilize things. You can coerce and force stability into a situation that isn't necessarily optimal for human flourishing and human development. So I think the main thing is you have to find the right balance between the forces of stability and the forces of human promotion and dignity. And can we get there? Yes. What is it for Israel Palestine? It's a two-state solution with 67 borders, land swaps, compensation. On Iran, how do we end the war? We can end it today. tomorrow to just stop the war. You know, there's no reason for this war. We started it. You know, and I look, and if I look at Yemen, if I look at, you know, the Libya ceasefire, but fragile. When I look at Ukraine, Russia, when I look at any of the wars around the world, and there are many, less now than there used to be, but many, often a lot of the people here, you know about negotiations and foreign policy. Often the solution is kind of clear. Like, it's kind of obvious, the concessions that would need to be made. It's just that because of hubris, you know, humans won't make the concessions they need to be made. So I remember I was once meeting with Ambassador Palladro in Tunisia about the early negotiations with the Palestinians. And he taught me a lot of things I never forgot. And one of them was, it's always harder to negotiate with your own side than the other side. Like, talking to the Palestinians is a piece of cake compared to talking to Congress. You know, and so, a lot of the work of diplomacy is not getting the other side to agree with you. It's getting your own side to agree on a way forward that works for everybody.
Thank you very much. We have a number of other questions, but just are not going to get to them, but maybe you can talk with Dr. Lawrence afterwards. Thank you so much.
I'm going to go take another look at Genesis.
Our first coincidence. That's much better.
Dr. Lawrence, this has been fantastic. Thank you for sharing your extensive experience with us. Thanks for enlightening us about the influence that the Arab world has had on us, and perhaps how we should deal with our Arab brothers and sisters. And it's been a wonderful thing. I really appreciate it. I want to give you a gift that we give. It's a Chesapeake Bay Club. And hope that you can enjoy it, and think of us when you read it. Thanks a lot.
It's been great. And by the way, Sharon's been fantastic, but I have to say that she was a little lazy this time, because John Bolton's office is directly above mine in the same building, and I just was meeting with him last week out of the back parking lot, so she just like went one floor down to recruit me.
Okay, the world is small, right? It's great. Listen, guys, on the 3rd of June, we are going to celebrate the end of our program year, and we're going to have a very, very brief annual meeting and present our slate of officers for the next year. We'll also hear a really fresh perspective on the Middle East from Mohammed Suleiman, an author and moderate advocate with the global advisory firm. He advises us on, or advises them, investors and companies, on strategic and policy issues at the intersection of technology, artificial intelligence, finance, and energy. I think we're going to learn something, and I hope we see you all on the 3rd of June. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
My husband was with the State Department. So that was,
Yeah.
I could.
All right.